Hey y'all, my presentation is on the dry plate negatives process, and I'm going to focus on the photography that was made using the dry plate process in the Yukon and Alaska gold rush. Here's a photograph of a group of men who were seeking gold in the process. Uh, the gold rush that I'm going to particularly talk about happened between 1898 and 1899. This is Jasper Wyman. Was the primary photographer that I'm going to discuss today. Um, you can see has taken a lot of the photographs of the group of men that he was traveling with, and in the communities in which he lived and they built and lived while they were seeking gold. And you can always tell Jasper is in the photograph because he's got the string attached to his camera that sets the shutter that operates the shutter. So the gold rush photographers documented the 19th century gold rushes in the Yukon and Alaska, and they documented travel, their living conditions, prospecting camps, extraction techniques, the gold seekers themselves, and the communities that they created. And they used the dry plate negative process and gelatin silver developing paper. And without these photographers, we would know so much less about the gold seeking communities and how they actually traveled and lived and worked during that period. The dry plate process and the manufactured gelatin silver printing plate paper solves so many of the problems with the older wet collodion plates. So because of the use of these dry plate process, gold rush photographers have left us with a very rich visual history of the gold rush. And without the dry plate process, this would just have been impossible. So the wet negative plate had so many different problems. And the problems were number one, you had to immediately expose the print after you coated the plate. The chemicals were really volatile, they were explosive, they were dangerous. The fumes that they set off were dangerous. You had to immediately develop them after you exposed the photograph. And the primary problem to be solved was how to keep the collodion wet. In 1854, George Shadbolts invented a honey process, and this was honey diluted in a distilled water, and it kept the sensitized collodion moist, but it did not solve the problem with the immediate exposure and all the dangerous chemicals. In 1856, John Dillwyn Llewellyn, and probably you're going to recognize that name from our earlier class research project, invented an oxymill process. And this was honey and vinegar, and it kept the plate's photosensitive properties for months, but it reduced light sensitivity, and that meant that it increased the exposure time. Dr. J.M. Topinot in 1869 invented a dry collodion albumin process, but it was a time-consuming multiple-step process. First, you had to wash the plate of the excess silver. You had to do that while it was still wet. Then you coated the plate with tannic acid. You let it dry. You added iodized albumin, the silver nitrate, and then you let it dry. It could be stored for weeks, but it lost 6 times a reduction in sensitivity compared to the other normal wet plate collodion method. A small British plate industry did develop, but the long shipping time to the US rendered the plates useless. By the time it left London and it traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City, the plates were just did not work. Then Dr. Richard Leach Maddox in 1871 published an article about a process that he was able to make that was a commercially viable dry plate. So we're going to mark the development of the dry plate process as 1871. And it absolutely revolutionized photography. First of all, dry plates could be prepared well in advance. and after their exposing, they could be stored for weeks before developing. And probably most importantly, dry plates could be commercially produced and shipped. So the dry plate negative was just began this photographic revolution. And the way that it happened, sensitizing chemicals were coated on a glass plate, and the it was using a gelatin emulsion instead of the older collodion foundation. And the gelatin emulsion was composed of gelatin, think Jello, nitric acid, hydrochloric acid, cadmium bromide, and silver nitrate. Think of those items as being uh, pieces of fruit in a Jello salad. Then the plate was allowed to dry. And here's the advantages: it had the very long storage life. It was 60 times more light sensitive than wet collodion plates. Maddox did not patent his invention because he wanted to support the expanding photography community, and we are just really blessed that he was so generous with his invention. Then there were improvements to Maddox's invention. John Burgess and Richard Kennett in 1873, they did improvements by cooking or heating the gelatin emulsion, and this expanded light sensitivity. Charles Harper Bennett in 1878 made further improvements. He developed a process that hardened the gelatin emulsion that increased its resistance to friction that previously had left marks on the finished prints. This made the gelatin emulsion even more stable, and it increases light sensitivity so that exposures could be made in only a fraction of a second. And the improvements opened the door to a burgeoning industry to produce dry plates that could be widely shipped and widely distributed. So George Eastman, boy, I sure would have loved to have met him. He must have been just such a quirky guy, inventor, entrepreneur. In 1876, he was only 24 years old, and he was working as a bank clerk in Rochester, the Rochester Savings Bank. And he was planning a trip to Santo Domingo. And a coworker suggested that he photograph his trip. So wet plate technology was the only widespread process at the time. So Eastman uh, bought a bunch of stuff, bought a bunch of supplies for his trip. He bought a box camera that was the size and weight of a modern microwave, a tripod that would support the bulk of a heavy camera like that. He had to get a tent because you had to work in the dark. So in the tent, he would be able to coat the emulsion on the glass plates and also develop the plates in the dark. He had to buy glass jugs of chemicals, glass tanks, heavy plate holders, jugs of water, and he said that the outfit was a pack horse load. Then on a later trip, a jug of chemicals broke and ruined his clothes, and Eastman declared the wet collodion process was just too much trouble. So he went home and he read about Bennett's improvements to dry plate. And then at age 24, he experimented in his mother's kitchen and was able to invent a machine that produced his own dry plates. So then at the age of 25, he went to London to meet with Charles Bennett and his partner Charles Fry, and realized that although the dry plate process was tremendously had tremendous potential, that these two guys just did not have the the infrastructure to be able to meet the expanding demand. So he went back home, and at the age of 25 in 1879, he applied for a patent for his dry plate coating. And at the time, of course, he was still a clerk in a bank. And then in 1880, he began commercial production of dry plates. He rented a loft in Rochester, New York, and used the machine that he had developed, that he had invented to make these dry plates. And a year later, the demand soared for his dry plates. He left his bank job and he opened the Eastman Dry Plate Company. And again, at age 27. Such an entrepreneur. In 1883, the company moved to its current site in the Kodak headquarters in Rochester, New York. And then in 1884, he still was not happy with the glass plate negative process, and he began experimenting with celluloid film as an alternative carrier for emulsion instead of glass. Of course, a related development for this that made the dry plate process so much easier and so much more convenient for photographers was the gelatin silver developing out paper. And one of our other students, Cole, has described about the the use and the development of the gelatin silver developing out paper, but I'll just like briefly explain, refer to it here. So developing out was using chemicals to produce images instead of the UV light. It was a latent image that was formed by contact printing or projecting a negative with an enlarger. The emulsion was potassium bromide, silver nitrate, and gelatin, and it was coated on a fiber paper base. Kodak, of course, later used a rosin-based paper. Developing this is what was really key. It's just used black and white developer, an acid stop bath, and then fixed in a bath of sodium thiosulfate, which we now call hypo, and washed with water. And it was considered the gelatin silver developing out paper was considered to be the gold standard photographed paper for nearly 100 years. And you can just imagine the wet collodion process, how cumbersome and actually nearly impossible it would have been for gold rush photographers to travel into the back country with the wet collodion supplies that was, to quote George Eastman, was like a packload, a mule packload worth of supplies. So we're going to start looking at some of the Jasper Wyman photography here of the gold rush. So he was originally from Galesburg, Illinois, and he and some of his friends formed a mining company, the Galesburg Mining Company, and they traveled from Illinois by train to Seattle, and from Seattle they took a steamship up north to the Kyokuk River Basin in northeast Alaska. And here they are in the riggings of the ship that they took from Seattle up to I think they landed at Nome first and then traveled by foot and steamboat up the river. Just imagine trying to haul all the wet collodion plate process material supplies compared to the ease of the dry plate process. Uh, and again, the beauty of these photographs from the Yukon and Alaska Gold Rush is that we get the details of what they actually did to seek gold. And here they are camping in a tent on their way up to the Kayakuk River area. This is at St. Michael's, which was one of the river bases where they stopped over to get supplies. There were a lot of Alaska Native people who were living there. It was a missionary at the time, and they did some trading and engaged with the local Native people. And of course, Wyman and these photographs document all these kind of activities. This is further up the river in Arctic City, which you can see that Arctic is misspelled. But this was on their way up to their final place. So Arctic City was one of about 10 different gold-seeking communities that Jasper Wyman uh, photographed. He traveled from place to place. And imagine, again, with the wet collodion process, it would have just been impossible for him to do this kind of work. But what he was able to do is he would take these photographs, and when he could, he would develop them. But most of them, he just exposed the plates, and then after they left, about six to 7 months later, he traveled to Nome, and that's when he actually printed them out. So you see on the side, on the left-hand side in the lower part, August 21, 1898. Remember that this process required photographers, when they wrote on the negative themselves, that they had to write it backwards. Here they are lining up the supplies up the Alatna River. This was just in early fall 1898, and again by Jasper Wyman. You can see several flaws in the print here. These were flaws that were actually on the negative. So even though the dry plates could be stored for months, there were still obviously difficulties in the storage, maybe for the long period of time, but also because it would take these photographs and store them, and to go on with this travel. And so they actually, the negatives, spent the winter, um, in a box somewhere, and it was not until like 6 or 8 months later that they were actually printed. So um, it's really interesting, the flaws, and actually the flaws kind of make it more, I guess, demonstrates the difficult circumstances under which the photographers worked. So here's a photograph, a group photograph in front of one of the cabins that the guys built. And the red arrow, that's Jasper Wyman, and you can see that that's him, and he's a photographer because there again, he's got his string attached to his camera. This shows how they actually used a whipsaw to be able to saw the logs for the cabins that they built. And again, it's the dry plate process that allowed photographers to document all these kind of activities that the gold seekers engaged in. This, if you are a student at University of Alaska Fairbanks, you have likely seen this photograph by Jasper Wyman that's in the library on the way to the Department of Music. This is a amusement gathering in Beaver City, January 18th, 1899. Jasper is not in this photograph, but you see the guy in the center with the big hair and the flower in his hair. That guy's Andy, and he shows up in Jasper's diary quite a bit. So Jasper kept a diary of his daily activities and the activities of the gold seekers, but even more importantly for the purposes of this class, he kept a journal about each of the photographs that he took. And so that's how we have so much rich history because of the dry plate process. Here's another photograph by Jasper Wyman. This is in one of the cabins, and again you can see the flaws in the photograph. The flaws again are in the negative, not in the print. The prints, and therefore in the print, but the original flaws are in the negatives. And you see the guys had to have their eyes closed because some of the Jasper's photographs were taken with a flash, an explosive flash in these in the photographs during the winter. They finally ended up leaving, and this is again the dry plate process allowed us to see both the coming and the going of the gold seekers, of how they traveled. And this is Nome. So Jasper's diary notes that after he left the Kayukuk region and traveled to Nome, that's where he developed his prints. Excuse me. So you can imagine him in one of these tents, exposing his negatives, developing the negatives, and exposing the prints, which he sold to be able to finance his trip. So the next photographs are not Jasper Wyman's. They're taken by other Gold Rush photographers. This is one of the steamships, that the Excelsior, that was coming from the Yukon Gold Rush era down to San Francisco. And the text of this claims that the passengers were carrying about $500,000 in gold from the Yukon. So William Werner Shorthill was a newspaper founder and editor, and there's several of photographs attributed to his collection that appear in the Alaska archives all over the place. I don't know who the photographer was for these particular ones. I'm assuming that he had a staff photographer who worked for him, but it's unfortunate that the photographs the negatives don't have as much information as Jasper Wyman. Jasper Wyman was so careful to document everything that he photographed, and but the William Werner Shorthill collection does not have that kind of documentation. But again, it's given us such a clear view of what actually the gold seekers had to do to be able to find their gold. Here's another photograph. We do know the person who photographed this was Joseph N.E. Duclos. It was about 1897. And this is the title of this is 15 Days Cleanup by the Gold Run Mining Company. And this is from in the Yukon Territory again. So all those bags contain gold. And note that the guy on the right has got a pistol in his hand. So it's like this is again documentation of how the gold seekers had to protect their gold that they actually found. The guy on the left looked like maybe he was a banker or a businessman, but I sure wouldn't want to mess with the guy with the pistol. Here's a group of women who were in the secondary economy. This was in the Yukon. Actually, this is Dawson, and the caption gives us a hint as to uh, what part of the secondary economy that these women worked in. A group of bedrock workers in Dawson, Yukon Territory. So what the play on words here is bed. So I'm assuming that these are likely to have been prostitutes. So women were in the gold rush, and they've been documented, by gold rush photographers as prostitutes, as store owners, and dance hall entertainers and laundresses, cooks. So in some of the stampedes, the women would set up camps where they would do men's laundry, they would cook them hot meals, and presumably give them a good time in the bed. So some reflections on this project. First of all, the dry plate process using the glass plate negatives fell out of favor when Kodak invented the celluloid film in 1889, and then later the Kodak itself. Uh, the gelatin silver prints, as Cole has discussed, continued on in favor, but the dry plate process became just so much less convenient than the celluloid film that the Eastman had developed. But there are modern day practitioners who are reviving the process, and there's links in the last slide, which I'll also post down in the comments below, so you can take a look at that if you're interested. As far as the dry plate process and my own creative process, so in 2013 is when I first saw these photographs. Um, I started out with another photographer besides Jasper Wyman, looking for fiddlers in the gold rush. Um, for some reason that was what my interest was, and stumbled on the Jasper Wyman collection, and it just blew my socks off. And so in 2013 it launched several new sociological research topics for me. I've done a couple of YouTube videos, which I will link also down in the comments, and I've published several research papers on various social factors that Jasper Wyman's photographs have like raised for me. And then to conclude, that the dry plate process was a key factor for contemporary social historians to understand the Alaska Yukon gold rushes. In short, we would know so much less if the photographers had to rely on the wet collodion process compared with the dry plate process that just revolutionized photography. Thank you for uh, letting me go on and on about one of my most favorite photographers and processes. And I look forward to conversation about this and the other wonderful, wonderful presentations that y'all are doing.